strange girl in the forest. It was a cold and quiet night in the forest near the edge of a small town where an old man named John lived in a wooden house with his dog Max, and his memories of a quiet life. John was a farmer who loved peace and silence, and he did not like trouble or change. But that night something strange happened, something that he had never seen or heard before. As he was closing the barn door, he heard a loud noise in the sky like thunder mixed with a strange echo, and then a flash of blue light crossed the sky and disappeared behind the trees. Max started barking and ran toward the forest, so John picked up his flashlight and followed him into the dark. The trees were tall and the wind was cold, and John kept walking deeper and deeper into the forest, following the barking of Max and the strange sound that came from somewhere ahead. Then he saw something glowing near a tree, something small and blue like a fallen star or a piece of the sky, and as he got closer he saw that it was not a thing but a girl with skin that looked like the night sky, and eyes that glowed like small moons, and hair that flowed like liquid light, and she was shivering and scared, and her clothes were torn and strange like nothing from earth. John stopped and looked at her, and she looked back with wide eyes, full of fear and confusion, and she tried to speak, but her voice was soft and broken, and in a language he could not understand. Max growled at first, but then slowly walked closer and sniffed her hand, and then sat beside her like he knew she needed help. John did not know what to do, but he saw that the girl was hurt and cold and alone, and something in his heart told him that she was not a danger, but someone lost and in need. He slowly reached out his hand and spoke gently, telling her it was okay and that he would not hurt her, and after a moment, she touched his hand with shaking fingers and looked into his eyes like she was searching for trust. John picked her up carefully and carried her back through the forest to his house, where he gave her a blanket and sat her near the fire and offered her warm soup and water. Girl did not eat much, but she looked around with wide eyes like everything was new and strange, and she kept touching things like she was learning the world through her fingers. She held a small device in her hand, something smooth and silver with blinking lights and symbols on it, and when John tried to touch it, she pulled it back quickly and held it close like it was very important. That night she slept on the couch under a heavy blanket, and Max curled up beside her like a guard, and John watched them both, wondering who she was and where she came from and why the stars had brought her to him. In the middle of the night, John woke up to a soft light coming from the living room, and when he walked in, he saw the girl floating just a little above the couch with her eyes closed and her hair glowing gently in the dark. She was whispering in her language, and her device was blinking faster and faster, like it was trying to connect to something far away, and then it made a quiet sound like a signal had been sent into the sky. John stood still and did not move as he watched the girl slowly come back down and open her eyes for a moment, and in that moment he saw sadness and fear and something more, something deep and old and full of mystery. She looked at him and whispered a name in her language, soft and careful, and the word sounded royal and strange like a secret from another world. A Relilith name echoed in the room, and then she closed her eyes and went back to sleep like nothing had happened. John sat in his chair and looked out the window at the stars and the dark sky, and he knew in that moment that his life had changed, and that the girl was not just a visitor from another place. She was something more, something important, something lost. And somewhere far away in the silent corners of space, a signal moved through the dark, a signal that said one thing: the princess is alive, learning to be human. Morning sunlight touched the windows of the small wooden house where the strange girl now lived, and inside the warm kitchen, John stood with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching her as she slowly walked across the floor with careful steps, like every sound and object was new to her. Her name was still a mystery, but John had started calling her Leah, and she did not seem to mind, so the name stayed. And over the days, Leah had begun to respond when he called her, and that simple thing gave John a strange comfort he had not felt in years. She sat on the wooden chair at the breakfast table, staring at the toast in front of her like it was a puzzle from another world, and maybe to her it was. and when John showed her how to hold it and take a bite, she smiled for the first time, and her smile was soft and curious and full of questions. Every day was a lesson for her, and everything was strange and beautiful, from spoons and pillows to clouds and birds, and she would press her hand against the glass window for hours, watching the trees move in the wind and the way sunlight touched the leaves. Leia learned words slowly, and her voice was gentle, like the wind through the trees, and she often repeated things John said, trying to understand their meaning, and sometimes she would draw symbols in the dust on the table with her finger, symbols that looked like stars and lines and circles that made no sense to him. Max, the dog, had become her shadow and followed her wherever she went, and though he had been unsure at first, now he seemed to sense something kind and calm in her, and often slept beside her feet with his head resting on her toes. One afternoon, John took her to the small market in town, and people looked at her with wide eyes because of her strange skin and glowing eyes, but she kept close to John and smiled shyly at the people, and some children waved at her, and she waved back with wonder in her eyes. She saw a baby cry and looked confused, and then she walked over and gently touched the baby's hand, and the baby stopped crying and laughed, and Leah laughed too, and in that moment she looked more human than alien. But not everything was simple, because at night when the house was quiet, John would sometimes hear her speaking in her strange language to the blinking device she kept hidden in her coat, and her words were soft and filled with longing, like she was trying to call someone who might never answer. One evening, John walked into the living room and found her standing in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection with tears running down her cheeks, and when she saw him, she quickly wiped them away and tried to smile, but her eyes were too full of sadness. She pointed at herself and said the word "not human," and then pointed at him and said "human good," and then placed her hand over her heart and said, "Leah, human maybe," and John nodded and said, "Yes, you are good too." That night John sat alone thinking about all that had changed. You are good too. That night John sat alone thinking about all that had changed since Leah came into his life, and he wondered what kind of world she had come from and what she had lost to end up here, and he knew deep inside that she was not just any visitor from the stars. One morning, as Leah helped him plant seeds in the garden, she touched the soil and closed her eyes, and for a moment the plants began to grow faster, like her touch carried life and energy, and she looked at John with surprise, like even she did not know what she had done. Later that same day, as she stood by the river skipping stones, she looked up at the sky with a strange expression and whispered something under her breath, and the device in her pocket blinked once more with a soft blue light. She was changing slowly, learning, slowly becoming something new, and her heart was now part of Earth and her soul still reaching for the stars. And in the quiet of the evening she sat by the fire and looked at John and said thank you, and the way she said it carried more than just words. John smiled and nodded and felt something stir in his chest, something like hope or love, or maybe both, and he knew that whatever she was, wherever she came from, she was now a part of his world. As the night grew dark, Leah stepped outside and looked at the sky, and the stars seemed to shine brighter above her, and in the silence, a name echoed once again in her mind, Arelena, and she did not know why that name brought both pain and strength. Far above the earth, in the black silence of space, a dark shape moved slowly, watching, listening, waiting, and on a small screen, a signal blinked again. Received. The princess is learning the secret she hides. The wind moved slowly across the hills that morning, and the sky was gray like a quiet warning, and inside the small house, Leah sat by the window with her eyes fixed on the clouds and her fingers tracing circles on the glass like they were unlocking something hidden inside her. She had been on Earth for many days now, and every day felt both safe and strange, like a dream she could never finish, and though John treated her like family and the town was peaceful, she knew something was missing, something waiting in the shadows of her memory. The strange silver device she kept close still blinked at night, but now it also hummed with a sound that Only she could hear a soft pulse that spoke to her in whispers from faraway places. John noticed that Leah had become quiet again, more distant, more thoughtful, and when he asked her if she was okay, she smiled and said yes, but her eyes told a different story. One evening while John was asleep, Leah walked into the barn holding the blinking device, and as she stood under the hanging tools and old wooden beams, she spoke into it using her true voice and her true words. Her voice unlocked something, and suddenly, her eyes turned brighter and her skin shimmered like the surface of water touched by stars, and around her the air began to feel heavy and alive. The device projected an image in the air, a moving picture of a place she had seen only in her dreams. Tall towers with lights that danced in the sky, and ships that floated through blue clouds, and people with robes and crowns bowing before a figure in the center. It was a child. It was here. A name echoed through the barn, Aurelina, heir of Zindar, light of the seventh galaxy and protector of the silver moons, and Leah fell to her knees as the image faded and tears rolled down her face. Because now she remembered the palace of crystal and gold, the warm hands of her mother, the strong voice of her father, the laughter of her people, and then the screams, the fire, the betrayal, and the escape. She had been sent away during the attack, hidden in a rescue pod, and programmed to land on the nearest peaceful planet, and that planet was Earth now. She understood why her heart felt heavy, and why her dreams were filled with stars and fire, because she was not just a lost girl. She was a hunted royal, a child of a fallen world. The next morning she told John the truth, and she spoke slowly and gently, choosing words that he could understand, and John listened without saying anything, his hands folded, his face calm, but his eyes filled with wonder and worry. He asked her if the people who hurt her family would come looking for her, and she nodded and said maybe, or maybe they already are. That same day a strange event happened in the forest. A silver object crashed through the sky and hit the ground not far from the house, and the sound shook the earth and made the birds fly away in fear. John and Leah rushed to the place and found a piece of metal glowing hot with symbols neither of them could read, but Leah stepped closer and touched it, and the metal responded by lighting up and showing a small moving map of space with one dot blinking brightly over Earth. She looked at John and said, "They know I am here," and he looked back at her and said, "Then we will be ready." That night, Leah stood in the field behind the house with the wind blowing her hair and the stars watching silently from above, and she held her device and pressed something, and it opened to reveal a small crystal glowing with blue fire. She placed the crystal on the ground, and from it rose a protective shield that shimmered in the dark like a quiet guardian. John watched from the porch and said, "You really are a princess." And Leah smiled and said, "I was a princess before, now I am something else." And then she turned back to the sky and whispered, "I will not run again, far beyond the stars in a ship hidden in the black." A voice spoke to a shadowed figure and said, "Signal confirmed, target identified, location, Earth mission begins." The figure replied, "Bring her back or destroy everything in your path, fire coming for her." The morning was quiet, but the sky felt heavier than before, and the wind moved in strange circles around the old wooden house where Leah stood with her eyes closed, listening to sounds that no one else could hear. John was inside fixing the old radio, but it made only static and noise. And he looked at the machine, then at the clock, and felt a strange weight in the air, like something was not right. Leah walked to the edge of the forest, where the trees whispered secrets, and the earth felt warm under her feet, and her hand reached for the crystal hidden in her pocket, glowing faintly like a sleeping heart. She knew they were coming, and not just one or two, but many, with ships and weapons and orders to bring her back or end her life. Far above the clouds, a ship moved like a shadow across the stars, quiet and fast with no lights, and inside that ship stood a tall figure with metal skin and red eyes watching Earth through a dark screen. Target confirmed, Earth coordinates locked, no response from signal, beacon mission begins now. Back on Earth, Leah returned to the house and told John to gather food and supplies, and to keep the lights low at night, and to trust her no matter what happened, because danger was now close. John asked how close, and she looked up at the sky and said, "Close." enough to see us and close enough to strike. That night Max began to bark at the forest and would not stop, and when John opened the door, he saw nothing but felt something watching from the trees. Something cold, and without breath Leah stepped outside and placed the crystal on the ground again, and it formed a small shield around the house like a dome of light. Invisible to the eye but strong against anything not of this world. In town, people noticed strange things, like flickering lights and machines that stopped working and birds that flew in circles, and the air near the hills began to smell like burning metal too. Men in black suits arrived at the local police station, showing badges with no names and asking strange questions about a girl with glowing eyes and blue skin, and they said it was national security, but their voices did not sound human. One of them walked past a dog, and the dog growled with fear and ran away, with its tail down and eyes wide. That same evening Leah sat with John and told him more about the night her world fell, and how the people who chased her were once royal guards turned into hunters, and how they now served a ruler who feared her return. John listened without fear, but with quiet strength, and said, "You are safe here, and I will protect you." And Leah placed her hand on his and said, "I know, but I must protect you too." Next day a strange signal was picked up by a weather satellite, and scientists could not explain the energy pattern or the language. But it repeated one message again and again: "Princess located, prepare for extraction." Leia stood on the hill near the house and waited with her eyes on the sky, and her hand on the crystal, and her heart calm and ready. And as the sun set, a dark shape moved through the clouds, fast and silent. It landed deep in the forest, and lights flashed for a moment, then disappeared, and the hunters stepped onto earth, covered in armor and shadows, their faces hidden and their voices cold. They moved without sound, scanning the ground for signs of the princess, and one of them found the broken signal device she had buried as a trap, and he whispered to the others, "She knows we are here." Leah felt the earth shift under her feet as they came closer, and she turned to John and said, "Tonight we fight or we run." And John said, "We stand." As night fell, Leah placed the last of her crystals in a circle around the house and spoke to them in her old language, and they rose like quiet stars floating in the air, ready to defend. Max stood beside her, tail still, but ears alert and eyes focused, and in the silence they waited as the hunters crossed the last trees between them and the house. From the shadows came a voice speaking in her tongue, calling her name, not with kindness but with command, and Leah stepped forward and answered, not with fear but with strength. "I am Aralina, princess of Zindar, daughter of the true light and guardian of the silver moons, and I do not run." The wind stopped, the trees held their breath, and the stars above blinked once as if watching what would happen next. The hidden power within the air around the farmhouse felt sharp and heavy, like something was pressing down from the sky, and the birds that once filled the trees had gone silent as if they too knew what was about to come. Leah stood barefoot on the grass, her eyes closed and her hands stretched out, and her breath slow and steady, like she was listening to something deep below the earth or high above the stars, and her fingers moved like she was holding something that no one else could see inside the house. John packed a small bag with food and water and a few old tools, not knowing if they would ever return, and he paused to look at a photo of his late wife before slipping it inside the bag with care. The hunters had not attacked the night before, and that silence felt more dangerous than action, like a storm gathering behind a wall of stillness, and Leah knew they were waiting for the right moment to strike, or perhaps trying to see how strong she really was. She walked into the forest early that morning with Max following close, and in her hands she held a piece of metal from the crashed probe that had burned through the sky days ago, and the symbols on it pulsed with light. As if they were alive, she stopped near a large old tree with roots like arms reaching into the soil, and placed the metal on the ground, then knelt beside it and pressed her palm to the earth and whispered words in her ancient tongue, words that had not been spoken on earth since time began. The ground trembled softly, and a thin light spread from her hand into the soil, and the tree began to glow from inside, like it remembered her voice, and its branches moved as if touched by wind that came from the stars. A door opened at the base of the tree. Not a door made by tools, but a natural opening formed by energy and time and memory, and Leah stepped inside without fear, and the roots closed behind her, leaving the world above in silence. Chamber inside the tree was round and filled with light that had no source, and walls that shimmered with colors that changed like water, and in the center stood a crystal taller than her body. Floating in the air, spinning slowly, she approached it and placed both hands on its surface, and at once images filled her mind, the halls of Zinder, her parents, her people, her escape, and the ancient voice of her mother, saying, "You are not just royal, you are the bridge between stars and soil power." Flowed into her body like fire and water and wind all at once. And her skin glowed brighter than ever, and her eyes turned silver, and the mark of her house appeared on her forehead like a crown of light. She cried without sound as the crystal whispered one more truth that had been hidden from her. You were not just sent to survive, you were sent to return and rise and remember who you truly are above ground. John waited near the edge of the forest, his heart heavy with worry and his eyes fixed on the trees. And Max sat beside him, growling softly as if sensing something beyond what eyes could see. Then the sky cracked open with a sound like thunder mixed with music, and light poured through the clouds, and the earth shook, and the tree split down the middle as Leah rose into the air, glowing with power and calm and strength. She landed softly and looked at John and said, "I am ready," and he nodded without needing to speak, and for the first time he saw not a strange girl, but a being of grace and courage and light. That night the hunters returned their ship, silent above the trees, and their forms slipping through the darkness like smoke and ice, and this time they did not hide. They came with weapons raised and voices shouting her name like a command. Leah stepped forward and raised her hand, and the crystals she had planted lit up in response, forming a barrier of energy around the house and the field, and the trees bending light and sound and time itself. The hunters attacked, but their weapons melted in the air before they could strike. And one by one they fell to the ground, frozen by a force they could not understand, a force born not of war, but of will. John watched from the porch, his heart racing and his mind struggling to believe what he saw, and beside him Max stood silent, tail still, eyes wide, as Leah walked through the wall of energy and stood face to face with the last hunter. Raised his arm to strike, and she placed her hand on his chest and whispered a word not of death, but of sleep, and he fell gently to the ground, and the ship above began to fade and drift away like a shadow losing its light as the wind returned and the stars watched from above. Leah turned to John and said, "The battle is not over, but I have remembered who I am, and they cannot take that from me." The last stand on earth. Darkness covered the hills like a blanket of ash, and the stars above flickered like they were warning the world below that something great and terrible was about to begin. And in the quiet space between sky and soil, Leah stood at the edge of the forest with her hands open to the wind and her eyes glowing like the heart of a flame. John stood beside her, wearing his old coat and boots and holding a tool that would never be enough against what was coming. But he held it anyway because he had chosen to stand not as a soldier, but as someone who believed in what was right. The trees whispered in a language only the wind could carry, and even the animals had left their homes, sensing the shift in the air, as if the world itself had paused to see what would happen when the sky fell far above the clouds. The ship of the invaders returned, not hiding this time, but roaring through the atmosphere like a storm with fire at its wings and lightning in its engines, and inside it were warriors made of steel and rage, sent by the same ruler who had burned Leah's home. Ship cracked the sky as it hovered above the forest, its shadow swallowing the moonlight, and its engines screaming like the cries of lost stars, and a voice from within echoed across the land calling for the princess to surrender. Leah stepped forward and raised her hands, and the crystals she had placed weeks ago began to rise from the soil like blooming flowers of light, and they formed a ring around her and John and the house, each one pulsing with power drawn from the memory of a fallen world. Ship responded by opening its lower gates, and soldiers poured out like a flood of black fire, landing in the fields with weapons ready and eyes glowing red, and they moved in silence without fear or doubt, programmed only to complete the mission. John looked at them, then at Leah, and said one simple word, ready, and she nodded and stepped ahead of him with her feet barely touching the ground as the energy around her shimmered like water catching sunlight. Soldiers charged, and the crystals responded, sending out waves of force that pushed them back without touch, and the earth itself began to shake and split as if the roots below had woken from sleep to fight beside their guardian. Leah moved like light and sound in memory, her hands drawing patterns in the air that became walls and storms and fire and wind, and the soldiers fell not from wounds, but from the weight of her will, the same will that had once guided stars and oceans on her home world. The battle lasted for what felt like hours, though no clock could measure the weight of it, and the land bore the scars of light and shadow and power and silence. And when the final soldier fell, the ship began to tremble in the sky, like it knew its time had ended. But then something new happened, something that had not come before. A second ship appeared above the first, and it was not like the others. It was darker and older, and its design was not from Zinder, but from something older, something forgotten. From the belly of that ship came a figure cloaked in smoke and shadow, with eyes like mirrors and a voice that made the wind stop and the fire grow cold, and it said, "I am the last general of the void, and I have come not to take you back, but to end your line forever." Leah stepped forward and said, "I carry not only my line but the memory of all those who fell, and you will not break what was born in light." The general laughed and raised his hand, and from it came a beam of black energy that swallowed the air and burned the stars. Leah did not move, and instead she reached into her cloak and pulled out the royal staff. The staff was not a weapon of war, but a beacon of life once used by her mother to heal and guide. And now it pulsed with her voice, and her pain and her strength, and she struck the ground with it, and light erupted like a second sun. The black energy shattered, and the general screamed as the light crawled up his arm, turning shadow into dust, and he reached for one last strike, but the staff pulsed again, and he vanished with the sound of cracking stars. The second ship began to fall, and it crashed far from the house into the ocean, leaving no trace and no light and no sound. Leah stood in silence, and the crystals lowered back into the soil, their purpose complete, and John walked to her with Max behind him and said, "It is over." Leah looked at the stars and said, "Not over, but safe for now," and they turned back toward the house, where the lights still burned and the wind once again felt like breath, not warning.